All right, for more on this, we are now being joined by Ms. Catherine Hadda, Senior Visiting Fellow Chair on India and Emerging Asia Economics and former U.S. Consul General in Hyderabad, joining us live on the broadcast from Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us on the broadcast on WION World is One. We just saw a few moments ago, Prime Minister Narendra Modi has arrived at the White House. I want to begin by asking you, what are your expectations from this meeting and how do you see the India-US relationship evolving in Trump 2.0?
Well, thank you for having me, first of all, and namaskaram to you and to your audience. I would say that I expect this to be a fairly cordial meeting. As you pointed out in the program, it's interesting timing in that the president just announced his intention to impose reciprocal tariffs around the world. But that's a plan to do it. It's not going to happen now. And in fact, his Commerce Secretary said that the recommendations will be made of how to apply the tariffs. There's a lot of uncertainty how it would be done. That won't happen until April 1st. So in a way, this takes the heat off discussing tariffs during this meeting, I would say, because they can just agree to talk, which is something that would have probably happened anyway. I think there's a lot, that's not to say that there won't be bumps in the road ahead on tariffs, but I just don't think we're going to see a big blow up at this meeting. What we might see is some further heat taken off this issue if India, for example, or there's an announcement of India's intention to increase purchases of defense items, which is something that the president had raised with the prime minister when they spoke by phone in January. I've heard, liquefied natural gas. The prime minister met with Elon Musk and talked about the importance of high-tech cooperation. So perhaps, if there are some imports to be done related to that, and that might reduce India's trade surplus with the United States and thereby also take some of the pressure off reaching an immediate tariff agreement. But I would also think that there's quite a large agenda that the two will have, and some of that was again pre-shadowed by their conversation in January, just talking about China, its role in the region, the broader issues of Indo-Pacific security. There's also a lot going on in the Middle East right now, which I imagine they will talk about. There's the issue of Russia and Ukraine, and here's an area that really may see reduced tension or disagreement, I wouldn't say tension, between India and the United States, because the Biden administration, as we know, was fairly firm on the need to support Ukraine and how it viewed Russia in this dynamic. And the president has a different perspective, I think it's fair to say. So I think all those things may be discussed. And then there's the undocumented Indian, the deportations, which I'm sure will be raised as well.
Absolutely. In fact, I find it really interesting that you said that the announcement of the reciprocal tariffs may actually help reduce and take off some of the heat, because for me it appeared as though the comments right ahead of the bilateral, I reckon, would put some sort of a strain in the discussions. But I see your point, and I see how that would make sense. That being said, do you think this is perhaps a negotiation tactic, and perhaps this was just a way to signal what's to come?
Yes, I do. There are a lot of questions. I've been on a number of panels today. And for example, one of the questions that people have raised is, well, how do you do it? We're not exporting the same things to each other. So what do you mean by reciprocal tariffs? I mean, you wouldn't put a tariff on American shrimp necessarily,
Right.
It's just not going to work the way we get Indian shrimp. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty about how this will be implemented. But I also know that in the last Trump administration, we had trade talks, we had tariffs, reciprocal tariffs. They were never eliminated during the whole Trump 1 administration, and yet we had a lot of cooperation between the United States and India. And I certainly anticipate the same this time around.
All right. That being said, of course, when it comes to security and defense cooperation, what's your assessment of the relationship in that regard? Because we've seen that China's growing assertiveness is something that has been an issue for both the United States and India as well. What sort of cooperation can we see, if at all, on that front?
We will see continued cooperation, notably through arrangements such as the Quad. We know that Prime Minister Modi will be hosting the Quad Summit. We have to remember the Quad was resuscitated from its days around the time of the tsunami by the Trump administration. The Trump administration altered the entire architecture of U.S. government regional policy towards Asia, moving it from a Pacific strategy to an Indo-Pacific strategy, emphasizing the importance of India in the Pacific. I think India has also made a good case to the United States that the Indian Ocean is a region that we need to pay attention to. And then the Biden administration, carried all that work forward and elevated it to the level of leaders. And again, in that call in January, which there was a very brief readout, but it was very important from the White House. They did note that the Quad Summit would take place in India this year, and it didn't say the president would go, but that was sort of the implication, I believe. So I do think see more regional, smaller groups, bilateral initiatives, because the Trump preference is not for big groups like the G20 so we'll see a lot more smaller group cooperation and bilateral.
Of course, we've been talking about defense ties, we've been talking about security cooperation, trade as well. Just ahead of the meeting as well, the senior Trump administration officials was talking about how the India-US partnership is the most critical bilateral relationship of the 21st century. That being said, do you think there are perhaps some gaps that the two sides must work on?
Well, I think in general, the trade deficit isn't really the issue. It's the performance in a way of imports and exports generally. And I don't know, at the end of the day, all of this, the high-tech cooperation, who exports, who imports, it's up to our private sectors. But I do think we can set a framework to encourage more cooperation. I think and high tech is an area for that. I did want to just make a quiet note about the immigration issue, because we always say, and I said when I was in Hyderabad, the people-to-people ties animate the relationship, and they're the foundation. And there's no doubt that's true. And that's why these issues of H-1B and undocumented Indians are super important. The H-1B I'm actually more optimistic about, because I believe that there'll be an increasing pie for if given the attention, for example, in the United States on AI issues. So there may be more room for H-1B workers here. The undocumented Indian one, I have to say, is the issue that I worry a little bit about. India, as you say, is cooperating very well. Taking in undocumented Indians, says it's the United States' right to do that. But there was a dust up over the treatment of the migrants. And just speaking as a practitioner who oversaw a consulate in Hyderabad, sometimes these issues can sort of take off if an immigrant, for example, claims mistreatment, or they were unfairly targeted as illegal, but they thought they were there legally. These things can happen. And it's important, I think, for both sides to cooperate on both targeting traffickers, which everyone should be able to get behind, and then also public outreach to warn Indians, to work together to warn Indians not to immigrate to the United States. It's a no-win situation. It's dangerous to cross the border in Canada. It's been lethal in some cases. So that's the kind of thing I think we need to cooperate on. And I wouldn't take it for granted, because it strikes at the heart of the people-to-people ties. Unlike trade, this is what brings people together, is visas and immigration.
All right. Well, Ms. Catherine, Susan, and Jessica, thank you so much for joining us live on this broadcast. We'll continue to track all the developments closely.
Thank you.
For latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.